My daughter-in-law tossed my dinner plate in the sink like I didn't matter. So I picked up my pen and erased her name from the will. I've spent my life feeding people who only ever came to take. Now, I'm serving justice cold. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The evening sun filtered softly through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table where Betty Carson sat, quietly taking in the hum of Sunday dinner. The familiar smell of roast chicken filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of collard greens and the sweet, cornbread warmth that always made her feel at home. Her son, Kyle, sat at the far end, his fork scraping the plate in his hand with the kind of absent-minded precision that suggested he wasn't truly tasting his food, just going through the motions. Lindsay, on the other hand, was already halfway through her meal, a small, insincere smile tugging at her lips, a mask she wore too well. And then there was Sadie, sitting next to Betty, her plate untouched, her eyes wide, observing everything like a silent witness. Betty wasn't bothered by the silence. She never was. In fact, the quiet moments felt like a small rebellion. She had earned this peace after years of loud arguments, the raised voices that now seemed like they belonged to someone else. Now, the clink of cutlery against porcelain was the loudest sound in the room. She took another bite of her cornbread, savoring the subtle sweetness. The day was winding down, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. It was a feeling that had been building for some time, something Betty had learned to live with, and something Lindsay was more than willing to feed. Just as Betty was lifting a piece of chicken to her lips, Lindsay stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp, jarring sound that made Betty's spine stiffen. She didn't flinch. She never did. Lindsay walked over to Betty's side of the table, her heels clicking like a countdown. Betty watched her move, trying not to notice the way Lindsay's face twisted into that passive-aggressive expression, the kind that made Betty's blood simmer just beneath the surface. Without saying a word, Lindsay reached out and grabbed Betty's plate. Half-eaten, the chicken still there, the greens untouched. There was no hesitation, no softness in the motion. She simply snatched the plate with one quick, efficient move and marched toward the sink. Betty watched, the warmth in her chest cooling. The plate was slammed into the sink with a sound that echoed through the room, louder than anything else. A dismissive flick of the wrist followed as Lindsay turned back, meeting Betty's gaze with an infuriating smirk. "You weren't eating?" Lindsay said, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. Betty's eyes narrowed, but her lips remained a perfect line. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Kyle's eyes were fixed on his plate, his jaw tight, but his hands shaking slightly. He knew. He had always known. But he never stood up. Never took control. Not when it mattered. Sadie didn't say anything at first, but Betty felt the shift in the air, the quiet rebellion in the girl's stillness. Sadie's hands tightened around the edges of her napkin, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't done. Sadie finally said, her voice soft, but cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. It wasn't loud, but the weight of it hung in the room, heavy. Betty turned to Sadie, her heart swelling for just a moment. The girl had always understood. She didn't need to explain herself, not to Sadie. She never had to justify her decisions, her choices. But Lindsay was something else entirely. Betty picked up her fork, her grip steady as she slid another bite of cornbread into her mouth, chewing slowly, deliberately. Her gaze never left Lindsay, who was now standing at the sink, one hand perched on her hip, the other tapping rhythmically against the counter. A subtle reminder of the dominance she thought she held. But Betty? Betty was no longer bound by the strings Lindsay thought she could pull. She was no longer the woman who would simply smile and take it. The silence was a weapon. It was a choice. And Betty had just made hers. As Lindsay began to turn away, her smirk still lingering like the sour aftertaste of something left to fester too long, Betty stood up, slow and purposeful. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke for her. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of something far more dangerous. She knew, in that moment, that this wouldn't be the last time Lindsay underestimated her. And Betty had plans. Plans that would change everything. The plate may have been tossed in the sink, but her legacy? That was still hers to shape. The kitchen was still. The faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house as Betty made her way back to her room. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. The weight of the moment sat heavily on her shoulders, yet the silence of it felt almost comforting. Her footsteps were slow but deliberate as she crossed the hallway. The house, familiar and filled with years of history, seemed colder now. The scent of dinner still lingered in the air, mingling with the ever-present sense of impending change. She had been silenced too many times, and now it was her turn to control the narrative. Once inside her room, she shut the door gently behind her, as if trying to keep the world at bay for a moment longer. The walls, lined with faded family photos and yellowed curtains that had seen better days, offered her a strange sense of solace. This was her space, her sanctuary. She moved to the old oak desk, its surface cluttered with papers, pens, and forgotten books. The drawer creaked as she pulled it open, the familiar motion like a sigh of relief. The drawer wasn't filled with trinkets or jewelry, just the important things. The things she had kept for years, like the brittle pages of old estate documents that now felt more like an anchor than a record. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid the papers out, the edges worn from decades of use. She had known this day would come. She had always known. But that didn't make it any easier. The ink was still dark on the pages, the names clearly printed, but it was the name she focused on now. The name that had become a burden she could no longer bear. Lindsay Carson, secondary beneficiary. Betty's eyes narrowed as she traced the letters with the tip of her finger. The name seemed to mock her, a reminder of everything she had endured in silence. Of everything she had let slide for the sake of family, of maintaining peace. No more. Her hand moved slowly to the pen lying next to the papers. She had never thought of herself as someone who could erase the past so easily, but in this moment, it felt like the only way forward. Without hesitation, she crossed the name out in thick, deliberate strokes. The pen's ink bled through the paper, making it feel like a declaration, a promise. As she stared at the crossed-out name, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over her. It was done. But it wasn't enough. The silence in the room felt almost oppressive now. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, staring at the name she had just erased, but the stillness was broken by the quiet buzz of her phone on the desk. It vibrated once, twice, before Betty picked it up without looking. Wanda. Betty's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she opened the message. Still need to update that will? Betty didn't hesitate. She typed her response quickly, the words coming easily as if they had been waiting to be said for years. Yes. Urgently. She hit send, her heart strangely calm in the aftermath. The words were final. The decision had been made. She leaned back in her chair, the cool wood against her spine grounding her. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no doubt. No fear. Only clarity. It wasn't just about the will. It wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about taking back control. About making sure her legacy was shaped by her choices, not by someone else's hand. The air in the room felt thick, but not oppressive. It was the calm before the storm. Betty glanced back at the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. But no one did. The world outside was still. The world inside was changing, piece by piece, with every decision she made. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of what she had just done settle in her bones. There was no turning back now. Monday morning was quiet. The air outside was thick with the kind of humidity that made everything feel sticky, but inside, the world was calm. Betty sat at her kitchen table for a few moments longer than usual, the silence offering her one final chance to think. She had never been one for grand gestures, but this was necessary. She'd given too much, let too many things slide, all in the name of family, but not anymore. Her fingers grazed over the edge of the envelope that sat in front of her, sealed and waiting. Inside, the weight of it was far greater than paper and ink. The will, her decision, the future. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt and walking toward the door. The house seemed to hum beneath her feet as if it knew what was coming, as if the very walls had long waited for this moment. Her steps were steady, purposeful. She wasn't nervous. This was something she should have done years ago. By the time she reached Wanda's office, the world outside had started to move. Cars passed on the road. People were out and about, the normal noise of the world beginning to return. But for Betty, the normal was gone. She had crossed a threshold, and the office building, neatly tucked into the heart of Chattanooga, felt like the only place where the next step could unfold. Wanda was sitting behind her desk, flipping through a stack of papers when Betty entered. She looked up, her eyes sharp, calculating, but not surprised. Wanda knew what Betty had come for. Betty didn't waste any time. She slid the envelope across the desk to Wanda, who caught it with practiced ease. The moment it touched her hands, it was like the air in the room shifted. Wanda's eyes flicked to the seal, then back up to Betty's face, searching for something. But Betty's expression gave nothing away. "This version needs teeth," Betty said quietly, her voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. Wanda didn't flinch. She opened the envelope with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. But as she pulled out the will and scanned it, her brow furrowed slightly. "You're serious," Wanda muttered, her gaze flicking from the papers back to Betty. Betty leaned forward just a fraction, her hand still resting on the edge of the desk. "I'm done letting people walk over me. Lindsay, she's out. Completely." Wanda took a long moment to process the gravity of what was being asked. Her eyes moved down the page, scanning the legal jargon, her fingers tracing over the clauses as if she could feel the weight of each word. She glanced up at Betty once more, searching her face for any hint of doubt. "We'll remove her fully," Wanda said at last, her voice low but firm. Betty nodded, her jaw set. Name, rights, access, everything. All of it. There was a silence then, a brief but heavy pause, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Wanda's eyes locked onto Betty's with an intensity that mirrored her own. "It's your house," Wanda said quietly, folding the papers in front of her and leaning back in her chair. "Your legacy. You're the one who decides who stays in it." Betty let out a small breath. Her fingers curled around the edge of the desk, grounding herself as the words echoed in her mind. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about control. It was about respect. And it was about making sure the people who mattered most were protected, even if it meant burning some bridges along the way. "I've decided," Betty said with finality. "Then I choose who stays in it." Wanda studied her for a long moment. There was no surprise in her eyes now, just quiet understanding. She knew Betty wasn't asking for a second opinion. She wasn't looking for validation. Wanda had seen it all. Familiar faces demanding more than they were owed, greedy hands reaching for things they didn't deserve. But Betty wasn't like the others. Betty wasn't driven by anger or vengeance. No, her motives were sharper than that. She was making a choice, not a statement. This was the first time in a long time she had taken control of something for herself, And that was more dangerous than any outburst. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, neither woman spoke. The papers lay in front of them, the words within them the key to a future neither would be able to undo. Wanda gave a small nod, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper, and began drafting the changes, her pen scratching against the surface of the desk. Betty watched her, her mind racing through all the possibilities of what came next. In that moment, she knew. This was the turning point. Betty's gaze lifted to the window behind Wanda, where the city sprawled out beneath the early morning light. It felt like the beginning of something new, something long overdue. And this time, there would be no going back. The hum of the office seemed distant, almost muffled, as Wanda continued to shuffle papers around her desk, each movement deliberate, precise. Betty sat across from her, her eyes steady, locked on the woman whose hands now held the future. The decision had been made, but Betty's silence was a subtle force, a presence in the room that spoke louder than words. Wanda paused for a moment, the papers in her hands like fragile promises, ones that could change everything with a stroke of the pen. She had seen many wills in her years, but this was something different. She knew that when Betty came through that door, she wasn't asking for simple changes. No, this was a declaration, a breaking point. "You understand the implications of this," Wanda said, her voice low but steady. "Removing her entirely from the will, trust, and power of attorney. There's no turning back once we proceed." Betty's gaze never wavered. "I've made my decision." Wanda nodded, and her pen moved across the page with practiced ease, crossing out Lindsay's name with a deliberate stroke. There was no hesitation in Wanda's movements, just the quiet rhythm of a professional doing what was asked, what needed to be done. The first name disappeared with the force of 100 unspoken words, but it was only the beginning. Betty was ready to sever all ties, and Wanda was the only one who could make it happen. "This will be airtight," Wanda muttered as she moved on to the trust. "No room for error." Betty's fingers clenched against the arms of her chair. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about something more. It was about respect. About cutting off the cancer that had slowly been poisoning everything. Lindsay had taken too much, and now there was nothing left for her. Nothing. Wanda crossed out Lindsay's name again, this time on the trust document. Her eyes flicked up briefly to meet Betty's, searching for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Betty's face was hard, determined, resolute. Next, Wanda reached for the power of attorney document. Betty could feel the weight of it in the room, the air thick with the finality of the decision. She had been patient for so long, letting things slide for the sake of family. But now? Now the weight was shifting, and she was ready to carry it herself. "Lindsay's removed," Wanda said quietly, setting the papers aside. "But there's still the matter of your son." Betty's gaze remained unfaltering. "Kyle, he gets a token amount, no more. He's always been weak. Let Lindsay call the shots. He never stood up for me." Wanda didn't argue. "I'll make sure it's all clear. No ambiguity. We'll lock everything down tight." Betty's lips twitched slightly. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way most people would expect. No, she had long since passed the point of rage. This wasn't vengeance. It was justice. It was about taking control of the legacy that was hers to shape. "I want Sadie to be the custodian of the house," Betty said, her voice soft but sure. "She's the only one who truly understands, the only one who cares about preserving the values this house stands for." Wanda nodded. She'd seen it in Sadie's eyes. The girl had always been quiet, respectful. She understood the weight of history and tradition in a way that Kyle and Lindsay never had. Betty wasn't just choosing Sadie as a caretaker of property. She was passing down something far more valuable, something Lindsay could never comprehend. "I'll add an emotional clause," Wanda said, her pen poised above the paper. Sadie must maintain the household values and keep the property in the family. If she ever tries to sell it, if she ever strays from what you've built here, everything reverts. I'll make it ironclad. Betty leaned forward, her eyes unwavering. No loopholes. I want her to have the strength to carry this legacy. But if she falters, there are no second chances. This house stays in the family. Forever. Wanda's gaze met Betty's, and for a brief moment, the weight of the words hung in the air. There was no room for sentimentality here. This was about keeping the heart of the house intact, keeping it from being lost in the hands of someone who didn't understand its worth. Betty's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, grounding herself. She could already see the future unfolding before her. Sadie, standing where she had stood so many years ago, in this same room, the same house, treating it with the care and reverence it deserved. I'll file these with the county today, Wanda said, breaking the silence, her pen scratching across the last line of the document. It's done. Betty stood, her back straight, her heart calm despite the whirlwind that had brought her here. Make sure there's no room for doubt, she said, and no one gets to walk back in here and claim what's mine. Not Kyle, not Lindsay, not anyone. Wanda watched her for a moment before standing, offering Betty a small but knowing smile. You've made your choice. I'll make sure it's sealed. As Betty turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet room, she knew she had made the right choice. The last name had been erased, the last link severed. It was done. And now, her legacy, her home, was in safe hands. The world outside had not changed, but Betty? She was finally free. The sun was high by the time Betty stepped into the bank, the heat of the day pressing down on her back, but she hardly noticed it. Inside the cool, sterile space of Mason Ridge's office, she was already preparing for the final act, where everything would be made official. The room was quiet, save for the soft tapping of Mason's keyboard as he pulled up the documents. Betty took a seat, the leather chair creaking under her weight as she slid the thick stack of papers toward him. Her gaze was sharp, focused. This was it. The culmination of everything that had led her here. The house, the legacy, and the final severing of ties that had bound her to a past she could no longer tolerate. Mason looked up, giving her a quick nod as he adjusted his glasses. So, we're finalizing everything today? His voice was low and professional, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity or perhaps respect for the gravity of what Betty was doing. Betty didn't answer right away. She just nodded, her fingers resting on the papers before her. The documents were a quiet rebellion in themselves. She wasn't just rewriting the terms of inheritance, she was rewriting the rules of her life. Mason moved with practiced precision, his pen scratching across the pages. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, the reality of the change becoming more tangible with every word he committed to paper. The notary stamp, the signature, the finality of it all. But Betty remained calm, her hands steady as she watched the process unfold. She had crossed every T and dotted every I. There would be no second chances now. The pen scratched against the page one last time, and Mason looked up at her, his expression neutral. Done, he said simply, and pushed the stack toward her. Betty picked up the pen, her fingers brushing over the signature line, her breath steady. The words had been written, but now she had to make them hers. She signed quickly, decisively. No hesitation. This was her life, her legacy. It was hers to shape, and no one was going to take that from her. Mason watched as she set the pen down, his voice casual but knowing. Not the first mother to change things after dinner, he said, a dry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Betty's lips twitched, and for a moment, she almost allowed herself to smile, but the weight of it all remained heavy. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't driven by petty emotions or a fleeting sense of anger. No. Betty had made a decision. She was rewriting her future, and that meant cutting off the past. Completely. "Then I hope I'm the last in this family," she replied. Her voice quiet but filled with a sharp finality that left no room for doubt. Mason nodded. "You'll be the last one to make this mistake." His words held a certain level of understanding, something that transcended the professional nature of their transaction. Betty wasn't the first person to be betrayed by family, to be left behind in the name of convenience. But she was doing what so many others had failed to do, taking back control. Once the documents were signed, Wanda arrived to file everything, her presence a quiet echo of the determination that had led Betty to this point. Mason shuffled a few papers, moving them into neat stacks as he prepared the final copies for filing. Wanda didn't speak right away. She just gave Betty a small nod, the kind that conveyed everything they both understood. The files would be submitted, and the changes would be permanent. Betty stood and stretched slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing as she turned to leave. But before she could reach the door, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps. "Grandma." Betty paused, her hand on the door handle. She turned to see Sadie standing in the doorway, her face uncertain but curious. The girl was a reflection of everything Betty had fought for: calm, strong, and grounded. A generation of resilience that Betty knew would carry the weight of the house far better than any of her other relatives ever could. Sadie hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice low but sharp. "Did you really take Mom out of the will?" Her eyes searched Betty's face, trying to find the answer in her expression. Betty met her gaze steadily, feeling the weight of the question in her chest. Sadie was the only one who could ask it without judgment. She wasn't angry, wasn't afraid. She was just seeking understanding. "Respect isn't free," Betty replied, her voice soft but resolute. "I've given enough. There comes a point when you have to choose who's worth it." Sadie didn't answer right away. She just looked at Betty, her eyes searching, calculating. But there was no judgment in her face, only understanding. She didn't need an explanation. She already knew. Betty placed a hand on Sadie's shoulder, a gesture that said everything that needed to be said. "It's time for this family to remember what really matters. And you, Sadie, you're the one who will carry it forward." Sadie smiled slightly, the corners of her lips curling up in the faintest trace of a smile. "I'll make sure of it." Betty nodded, feeling a small knot in her chest loosen. She was leaving a legacy, yes, but it wasn't the one she had once imagined. It was stronger. It was more resilient. It would last longer than anything Lindsay or Kyle could ever tear down. With one last glance at Mason and Wanda, Betty walked out of the bank. The doors closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. The world outside hadn't changed, but for Betty Carson, everything had. And there was no turning back now. The morning light poured through the windows of Betty's home, casting long shadows across the floor. The air was thick with the kind of humidity that made everything stick, but Betty didn't mind. She'd spent years living under layers of expectations, beneath a fog of resentment. But now, the weight felt different. Today was about removing the final traces of the control others had held over her life. Today, she would finish what she had started. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers tracing the cold edge of her coffee cup, her mind sharp and focused. She'd already signed the new will, severed all ties with Lindsay, and ensured Sadie would be the one to carry the legacy forward. But now it was time to shut down the access Kyle and Lindsay had, every connection they had to her life, her finances, her freedom. Betty rose slowly, walking across the room to her desk. The drawer slid open with a familiar creak, revealing the stack of documents she had meticulously kept for years. She reached for a specific set, the financial power of attorney forms. They were thick with authority, and until now, they had given Kyle and Lindsay the power to make decisions for her. But no more. With a steady hand, Betty crossed out the names, Kyle's first, then Lindsay's. The ink smeared slightly on the paper, the weight of the action heavy on her chest. This wasn't just a formality. This was her reclaiming her autonomy. No more would they have access to her accounts, to her money, to the very decisions she had spent her life making for herself. She folded the forms and slid them into an envelope, sealed tightly with the force of her intent. Her pulse quickened for a brief moment, but it wasn't fear. It was the clarity of her choice. It was done. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed the bank. The line clicked once, then Mason's familiar voice came through. Betty, what can I do for you today? Mason, it's time. I need everything changed. I want Kyle and Lindsay completely removed from any access to my accounts. Make it so they have nothing left. Her voice was clear, sharp, and decisive. There was no room for hesitation. Understood. I'll have the paperwork ready for you to sign. And for the record, I'm not surprised. You've been more than patient. Betty allowed herself the faintest of smiles. No patience left, Mason. It's time for things to be locked down. She hung up the phone and began moving through the house, preparing the last details of her plan. She wasn't just removing access to her financials, she was taking back control. She moved to her computer, opened her secure vault, and began creating new passwords for everything. The vault was airtight now, each password stronger than the last. Her entire life, her finances, her records, were hers alone, a fortress. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, typing in the complex characters that would ensure no one could access what was hers. The vault filled with keys, each one representing a door closed, a decision made, a life reclaimed. As she finished, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Kyle standing there, his face flushed with an uneasy combination of concern and annoyance. Mom, are you feeling all right lately? He asked, his voice laced with a thin veil of insincerity, the same way he had always approached her, half concerned, half accusatory. The words were soft, but Betty knew better. He wasn't here out of concern. He was here because he knew something was changing, and it was something he didn't want to acknowledge. Betty looked him over with a cool, calculated gaze. She had lived with him for years, watched him choose Lindsay over her time and time again. He had never stood up for her, not when it mattered. I'm sharper than you've ever treated me, she replied, her tone low, but cutting through the air like a sharp knife. Kyle blinked, taken aback, but it was too late. The words had been spoken. The silence that followed felt thick with understanding, the understanding that he no longer had any power over her. His eyes shifted, uncertainty flickering across his face. Before he could speak, Betty stepped back into the room and shut the door softly, not waiting for him to respond. She wasn't angry. No, she had let the anger go long ago. This was about clarity. She had made the decision, and now she would carry it through, no matter the cost. She walked back to her desk, where the envelope still sat. She picked it up, holding it in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of everything it represented. The names were crossed out, the decisions made, and the power had shifted. Betty placed the envelope in her bag and made her way to the bank. As she drove through the streets of Chattanooga, the city that had witnessed the rise and fall of her family's legacy, she felt a strange calm wash over her. The world outside hadn't changed, but inside, she was different, stronger, in control. When she arrived at the bank, Mason was waiting for her. She handed him the envelope without hesitation. He took it with the same steady hands, and within moments, the documents were filed. Everything was locked down, sealed, and secured. Consider it done, Mason said, his voice steady but with a hint of respect for the choice Betty had made. Betty stood, her back straight, her heart calm. She was done. No more uncertainty, no more manipulation. As she walked out of the bank and into the late afternoon sun, she couldn't help but feel a surge of power. The last thread had been severed, and now, there was no one who could take what was hers. The world had not changed, but Betty had. Betty's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, but she didn't even glance at it. The screen lit up with a message from Kyle, something insipid, no doubt, some half-hearted attempt to reconnect or apologize. She knew exactly what it was. But Betty wasn't in the mood for words that meant nothing. She had already heard everything she needed to hear, seen all the empty gestures and hollow apologies. Her fingers brushed the phone, pushing it aside without a second thought. The silence that followed felt almost sacred, like a barrier that had finally been built, a shield against the noise that had cluttered her life for so long. Wanda's words from earlier echoed in her mind, as they often did now. Silence is power. Betty had come to appreciate that wisdom more than she ever thought she would. Silence was an absence of effort, an absence of expectation, and it carried weight, more weight than any words could ever offer. No more explanations, no more justifications. She was done talking, done explaining herself to people who had never bothered to truly listen. She stood at the kitchen table, folding the last of the papers in front of her. Personal letters, addressed to the few people who mattered most. Sadie, the only one who truly understood. Wanda, her quiet support through it all. And of course, the estate documents that were locked down tight in the safe. But it was the letter for Sadie that lingered in her mind. Betty picked up the neatly folded letter, her hands moving with a careful slowness, as if the weight of each word on the page was too much to bear. She stared at it for a long moment. This letter wasn't just about possessions or the house. It was about legacy, about what Sadie represented, the future that Betty had fought to preserve. She opened the envelope and slid out the letter, her eyes tracing the words she had written the night before. She smiled softly as she read it, her heart swelling with something like pride, but tempered with the sadness of a woman who had finally made her peace. Sadie, because you saw me when others didn't. You understood when no one else could. This is my legacy, and it's yours now. The words were simple, but they were everything. She had spent so much of her life ignored, dismissed. But Sadie had always known. She had always been the one who saw her. Betty carefully sealed the envelope, pressing down on the flap with the back of her finger. She placed it on the table beside the stack of other letters that would be sent after her passing. There was no need to tell Sadie anything more. She would understand. She always had. A faint noise at the door caught her attention. Kyle had arrived, a little too late, and his presence filled the hallway with its usual dissonance. Betty could hear his voice, low and cautious, as he knocked, probably expecting a warm welcome. She didn't move. She let him knock again, letting the silence stretch, thick and unforgiving. Kyle was the one who had failed to see. Kyle was the one who had never really understood the sacrifices she made. And now, he was the one standing outside, knocking on a door that had already closed behind him. Betty's gaze shifted to the kitchen window, the faint light of dusk creeping through the curtains. The weight of the day was settling on her shoulders, but it wasn't the exhaustion of what she'd done. It was the relief that came with knowing it was done. The past was the past, and now the future was all that mattered. Her phone buzzed again. Kyle's name flashed on the screen, but Betty didn't even glance at it. She had seen enough of his messages, enough of his half-hearted attempts at reconciliation. Words were empty now. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the decision press against her chest. She walked to the door, opened it just wide enough to peek her head out. "Mom, are you all right?" Kyle asked again, his voice softer this time, a thin veneer of concern masking the anxiety beneath. Betty didn't say anything. She simply looked at him, her face calm, her gaze steady. She walked past him without a word. The door clicked shut behind her. Kyle didn't follow. He didn't have to. The sound of his footsteps faded as she made her way to the living room, leaving him standing there, unsure of what to do with the silence. Betty stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool air that filled the house. She could feel the walls around her settling into place, the legacy she had fought for taking root in ways that words couldn't describe. She hadn't needed to answer his question. The silence had said everything. The world had shifted, and there was no going back now. The smell of fresh rain clung to the air as Betty sat in her favorite armchair, the familiar weight of the day settling over her. The house, now quieter than it had been in years, hummed with the stillness she had worked so hard to create. Her fingers moved slowly across the letter she had just sealed, Sadie's letter. But it wasn't long before that fragile peace would be shattered by something she had anticipated, something she had prepared for. She wasn't surprised when the phone rang, but the name on the screen made her spine stiffen. It was Lindsay, of course. What had she done now? Betty let it ring twice, allowing the seconds to stretch long before she picked up. "Hello?" It was the voice on the other end that made Betty's blood run cold. "Betty, this is Pastor Daniels from St. James. I was just calling to check in on you." His voice was polite, almost soothing, but there was something underlying it, an edge she couldn't quite place. "We've heard some concerns about your health. From Lindsay, actually." Betty's hand tightened around the phone. She could already hear it, the insidious whisper of doubt. Lindsay, in her usual passive-aggressive way, had made it seem like Betty was no longer mentally capable of managing her own affairs. "I'm fine, Pastor," Betty replied, her voice as steady as she could make it, better than ever. There was a long pause on the other end. She could almost hear Pastor Daniels's hesitation, his uncertainty hanging in the air like a thick fog. "I understand. But, your daughter-in-law is worried. She mentioned that you've been confused, maybe forgetful recently." His voice was gentle, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent to it. He wasn't just asking for the sake of concern. He was fishing. Betty let out a breath, holding the phone tight as she struggled to keep her composure. She had known this would happen, had expected the doubt to creep in. But she wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them undermine everything she'd worked for. "No, Pastor," Betty said, the words coming slow and clear. "I've never been more clear-headed. I've made my decisions and I stand by them. You have nothing to worry about." She was done explaining, done justifying. She had already let them push her to the brink, but this was her life, her legacy. She had fought too long and too hard to let anyone take that from her, especially Lindsay. "Well," Pastor Daniel said, his voice softening, "I'll take your word for it. But Lindsay suggested we might schedule a little check-in, just to be sure. I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding, but perhaps we should arrange for someone to, you know, assess things formally." Betty could feel the blood rush to her face, but her voice remained calm, controlled. "If you think that's necessary, Pastor, then you can schedule it. But I can assure you there is nothing wrong with my mind. My decisions are clear." The line fell silent for a moment before Pastor Daniels sighed, a sound that almost felt apologetic. "I'll have it arranged. But Betty, if you feel any different, don't hesitate to let us know. We're here to help." Betty hung up before he could say anything else. She sat there for a moment, staring at the phone, her pulse still quick from the conversation. The audacity, the sheer nerve of Lindsay, to call into question her mental state, to take her decisions and turn them into a concern. It was exactly what she had expected, but she wouldn't let it stand. She knew exactly what she had to do next. Wanda had been expecting the call from Betty. There was no surprise in her voice when Betty mentioned the competency exam. "It's just a formality," Wanda said, her tone efficient but sympathetic. "We'll schedule it. Betty, don't worry. Once it's done, you'll have the documentation to shut them down for good." Betty didn't answer right away. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. This was the price she had to pay for standing up for herself, for cutting off the toxic people in her life. But she was willing to pay it. The exam was scheduled for the following week. Betty walked into the testing room with a steady stride, her back straight, her mind as sharp as it had ever been. She answered each question with confidence, her memory impeccable, her reasoning sound. She knew what was at stake, knew that this was just another obstacle Lindsay had put in her path, another way to undermine her. But she would pass. She had to. The results came back quickly. 100% clarity. There was no doubt about her competence. No reason to question her decisions. The letter of legal capacity, signed and notarized, was filed with the county immediately. No one could challenge her will now, not without looking like the fools they were. Mason was the one to file the paperwork, and when he called Betty to confirm it was done, she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "It's all locked up, Betty. No more concerns. Your decisions are final. Your legacy is secure." Betty sat in the quiet of her home, the weight of it finally lifting. No more doubt. No more questioning. But she knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Lindsay wasn't the type to give up so easily. And Betty? Betty wasn't about to let anyone take her peace from her. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the living room windows, casting long, angular shadows across the room. Betty sat at her desk, surrounded by piles of paperwork, her thoughts swirling with clarity and intent. The house felt still, almost as if it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. And it was a move she had planned carefully, methodically, as she had done with every other step of this journey. Betty's gaze rested on the legal documents in front of her. The will had been rewritten, the power of attorney permanently revoked. She had fought for her legacy, carved it out with her own hands, and now it was time to build the final walls, walls that no one could breach. Not Lindsay, not Kyle, not anyone. Wanda had been by her side through it all, making sure each decision was legally sound, each protection unassailable. Today, they were adding the final pieces to the fortress that would ensure Betty's wishes were honored. No one would stand in the way now. "Betty," Wanda said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the room. She stood beside the desk, the weight of the papers in her hands making it clear that this was no small matter. "I've drafted the affidavit. It's an added layer of protection. I've made sure that no one, especially Lindsay, can challenge your decisions after you're gone." Betty's hand, which had been resting on the edge of the desk, tightened into a fist. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She knew. This affidavit would legally cement the truth. Betty was of sound mind, and every decision she made was deliberate, intentional, and irreversible. No room for doubt. No room for interference. "I want it clear," Betty said quietly, her voice sharp, her eyes unwavering. "Lindsay is banned from any future decisions. She has no say over my property, my health, or my legacy." Wanda's pen moved across the document with careful precision, adding the final clause. The words were as solid as the walls Betty had built around herself over the years. No longer would Lindsay be able to manipulate or control. The reign of that cruelty was over. Betty leaned back in her chair, the weight of it all sinking in. It was a relief, but also a finality. There would be no going back now. But there was more to do. Much more. She reached for the next document, the one that had been waiting for this moment, the deed to the house. She had been careful to leave no loopholes, no room for error. She wasn't just protecting her wealth. She was protecting the heart of her life, the place that had held her family's history. The deed was updated with a new clause, survivorship-based, which meant that, upon Betty's passing, the house would go directly to Sadie. No one else could lay claim to it. Not Kyle, not Lindsay. The house would stay in the family, with someone who would appreciate it, protect it. Someone who had proven time and again that they understood its value. She nodded to herself, a flicker of satisfaction running through her veins. Sadie had always been the one to see her. She had always been the one who could sense what mattered. Betty knew she had made the right choice. The legacy would endure with her. Sadie would protect the house as it had protected Betty. Next, Betty turned her attention to the power of attorney. Her hand hovered over the document, which had been permanently locked. The form was stamped, sealed, and notarized. There would be no power granted to anyone now, not even Kyle, despite his proximity. The access to her finances and her decisions was entirely hers and Wanda's, sealed tightly with no possibility of future meddling. Betty had made it clear. There was no room for negotiation, no second chances. "Everything's locked up, Betty," Wanda said, her voice steady and firm. "No one can challenge it now. The affidavit, the will, the deed, the POA. Everything's set." Betty's gaze remained fixed on the papers in front of her. The final touch remained. She hadn't given much thought to the end of it all. What came after she was gone? But she knew that control had always been part of her life. Even in death, she wanted things to be done her way. She reached for the last folder on the desk, her funeral preference file. She had already made the arrangements, set the details in stone. She didn't want Lindsay involved. She didn't want the fuss, the spectacle. No, the funeral would be simple, dignified, and on her terms. Wanda placed the file in front of her, adding one final note to the bottom. No involvement from Lindsay, under any circumstance. The last of the control slipped into place, sealing her wishes with finality. Betty stood slowly, stretching her back after hours of paperwork. "It's all done then," she said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. Wanda nodded, her expression a mixture of admiration and satisfaction. "It is. Everything is locked down tight. You've done it, Betty. You've protected your legacy." Betty looked at the stack of documents before her, the weight of them now both a burden and a triumph. She didn't feel sad or wistful. She felt strong, solid in her choices. She had taken back control of her life, and in doing so, she had built something that could never be taken from her. There would be no more doubt, no more second guessing. Not from Kyle, not from Lindsay. The world outside hadn't changed, but Betty had. Her legacy, her home, was now in safe hands. Her silence, her choices, her protections were unbreakable. And if anyone tried to challenge it, well, they'd soon see just how impenetrable it all was. Betty turned, walked to the safe, and locked everything away. Her legacy was secure. The future was in Sadie's hands now. And for the first time in years, Betty allowed herself to relax, knowing she had won. The air inside Betty's house was heavy with the promise of what was to come. The final steps had been taken. The documents were locked away, her wishes clearly stated, and the layers of protection she'd built over the past few months were now impenetrable. Still, there was one last thing to do. Betty sat at her desk, the familiar click of the pen against paper sounding almost ritualistic. Her eyes swept across the formal notarized letter she had prepared, an official revocation of all rights, a final, irrevocable statement. It was time to send it. The words on the page were precise, unemotional. They didn't need to be anything more. The letter, neatly folded, was ready to be dispatched. She slid it into the envelope with care, sealed it, and with a steady hand wrote the address. She placed it in the outgoing mail stack with a small, quiet satisfaction. This letter would ensure that no one, especially Lindsay, could come back and challenge her will, her power, or her legacy. It was done. There was no going back. The final threads of control had been severed. Betty picked up her phone and dialed Wanda's number without hesitation. The line clicked, and Wanda's steady, familiar voice answered almost immediately. "Wanda, it's done. I sent the letter." Betty's words were clipped but full of purpose. There was no room for doubt anymore. "All rights are revoked." She could almost hear Wanda's smile on the other end of the line. "Good. It's all locked down now. They'll feel it eventually, feel the absence of what they thought they could control. But they'll never see it coming." Betty nodded to herself. They'll never see it coming. That was the essence of it. The power, the control, the legacy. Lindsay had never understood how much Betty had quietly orchestrated behind the scenes, how carefully she'd pulled every string. Now, Betty had moved into the final phase. A few hours later, her phone buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown number. It was Lindsay, of course. The panic was palpable in every word. "Did she really remove me from everything?" The message was short, rushed, as though Lindsay had sent it in a fury. She had probably been going through the estate documents with a fine-tooth comb, searching for any sign of hope, of loopholes, anything to salvage her position, but there would be nothing left for her. Betty sat back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the desk. A small part of her almost felt sorry for Lindsay. Almost. But that was fleeting. She had made her choice, and now it was too late for second chances. Betty typed the reply, the words succinct and final. "Try me." She hit send without hesitation. Lindsay would be furious, of course. She would be scrambling, trying to figure out how to fight it, how to claw her way back into the life she thought she was entitled to. But Betty wasn't worried. She had already prepared for that. She had known this day would come, and she had planned for it down to the smallest detail. Lindsay would rage, Kyle would continue to be absent, but none of it mattered. Betty had built her protection, and it was foolproof. A moment later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was Kyle. As usual, his message was far more passive, far less concerned with what was actually happening and more about his own discomfort. "She's bluffing, right?" Kyle's message was half hopeful, half questioning, as if somehow he thought Betty would change her mind, that she would back off from what she had set in motion. Betty let out a quiet, controlled laugh. She had been waiting for this too. Kyle had always been weak, indecisive. He hadn't had the strength to stand up to Lindsay, and now he was waiting for Betty to show weakness. But she had none to offer. She didn't reply to Kyle. She didn't need to. His uncertainty was his own problem. Instead, Betty focused on the task ahead. She walked to her desk where her computer screen lit up in front of her. The time had come to change everything. With the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, Betty logged into her bank accounts one last time. Every password had already been updated, locked into her new vault, where no one could access it. She clicked through the final security prompts and made the necessary updates. The final barrier was set, and her accounts were now more secure than ever. Once done, she closed the vault and sat back in her chair, a sigh escaping her lips. It was over. There was nothing more to be done. Betty had taken control of her life, her legacy, and her future. She had built walls around herself and her family, and now, with every document, every decision, she had made herself untouchable. No one could steal what was hers. She looked down at the screen one last time before standing and stretching her arms. The silence in the room was comforting now, a sense of peace washing over her that had been a long time coming. But she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of Betty's fingers moving over the papers. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, but Betty wasn't ready to sleep. There was still something left to do. Something small. Something personal that only she could complete. She had already taken the necessary steps to protect her legacy, but now she was reclaiming it in a more intimate way. She stood in front of her desk, sorting through an old family album, its leather cover worn from years of handling, from generations passed down in these walls. The photos inside were faded but precious. A snapshot of who they had been, of the stories that had built this house, this family. Betty knew that Sadie would understand its importance, its value far beyond the glossy smiles captured in those frames. Betty carefully arranged the photos in chronological order, placing the most significant ones on top. There was the black and white photo of her parents in their youth, standing proudly beside their first home. And beside that, a picture of her with Kyle as a young child, before the fractures began to show. She lingered on that one a moment longer, the warmth of it almost too painful, but she didn't flinch. It was part of her history, part of the legacy she had spent so many years trying to protect. Next, Betty reached for the deed to the house and the signed documents that had taken months to finalize. She didn't take the time to examine them again. She knew every word by heart now. She had read them, reviewed them, and reread them until they were etched into her mind like a blueprint for the future. She placed them carefully into the album beside the photos, each one as significant as the other, each a symbol of her fight to ensure this home would never leave the family again. But the last piece was the most important, the most personal. Betty sat down at the desk, picked up her pen, and began to write. "What respect means to me," she wrote at the top of the page, her handwriting flowing smoothly as she formed each letter with intention. She didn't hesitate as she began. This wasn't about eloquence, it was about truth. About standing firm in what she had fought for and what she believed in. Respect is not something you ask for. It's something you earn. It's something you hold on to tightly, even when the world tries to take it from you. I've learned that respect isn't just about being seen, it's about being heard. I spent too many years letting others speak over me, letting my worth be defined by their actions. But no more. I've learned that the quietest voice can carry the greatest weight if it's steady and unwavering. I've learned that respect isn't free. It's earned by those who see you for who you are and who fight beside you, not against you. She paused, reading the words back to herself. It was simple, honest, and yet, it was everything. It was her truth. Betty placed the essay carefully into the back of her trust binder, next to the photos and the signed documents. It was a symbol, a guide to those who would one day look at it and understand the depth of her decisions, the weight of the choices she had made. It wasn't just about money or property or the house. It was about the life she had built, the battles she had fought, and the respect she had finally reclaimed. Just as Betty closed the binder, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the sound of Sadie's soft tread. The door opened, and Sadie stood there, looking at her with that quiet, unspoken understanding Betty had come to rely on. "What's all this?" Sadie asked softly, gesturing to the album Betty had laid out on the desk. Betty smiled and motioned for her to sit. "This is the past," she said simply. "The legacy I'm passing down." Sadie approached cautiously, as if understanding that this moment was something important. She flipped through the album slowly, her fingers tracing over the photos, over the names and faces of relatives long gone. She stopped at the photo of Betty as a young woman, standing proud with her parents in front of the house she had made a home. Sadie looked up, her eyes soft but filled with something more, something akin to admiration. "You're the strongest person I know," Sadie said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Betty's heart swelled, but she didn't smile. She just nodded, looking down at her hands for a moment. "Not strong, Sadie. Just done being stepped over." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Sadie nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. She didn't need Betty to explain more. She had always known. Betty watched her granddaughter for a long moment, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. This was why she had done it. Why she had fought so hard to build this legacy, to pass it down to someone who would protect it, who would carry it forward. Sadie reached for the binder, her fingers brushing lightly over the pages, but her hand stopped when she reached the essay Betty had written. She read it slowly, her eyes scanning the words with reverence, and when she looked up again, Betty could see the depth of her respect, her love. "I'll take care of it," Sadie said, her voice steady, unshakable. "I promise." Betty's gaze softened. "I know you will, Sadie. I know you will." And in that moment, Betty knew that her legacy, her life, her fight, her choices would be honored. It would not be forgotten. The house, the family, the lessons learned, they were all in safe hands now. And as she watched Sadie sit there, the weight of the years lifted, Betty finally allowed herself to rest. Her legacy had been reclaimed, and it would endure. The house was quieter than usual. The usual hum of daily life had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to echo in the empty rooms. Betty sat in the kitchen, her hands folded in front of her, her mind as steady as the stillness around her. She had finally reclaimed her life, her legacy. But there was one thing left to confront. One last conversation that needed to happen. Kyle had been calling all afternoon, his voice increasingly anxious in his texts and voicemail messages. Betty had ignored every one of them, but now, she could hear his footsteps approaching. She knew what was coming. He was finally going to ask her, confront her about the decisions she had made, the decisions he still couldn't fully grasp. She wasn't ready for a fight, but she was ready for the truth. When Kyle appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with confusion and concern, Betty didn't need to hear him speak to know what he wanted. His posture was stiff, defensive, but there was an unease in his eyes that betrayed the practiced calm he tried to project. "Mom, we need to talk," Kyle said, his voice tight, almost desperate. He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. There was no anger in his voice, just confusion, disbelief. Betty looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She had given him every opportunity to stand by her, to be the son she needed him to be, but he had chosen Lindsay every time. "You married her. I lived with her," Betty replied, her voice quiet but firm. The weight of those words hung between them, the years of slights and silent smirks finally coming to the surface. She didn't need to explain anymore. Kyle had always known. He took a step closer, his expression softening. "But she's still family. You can't just—" Betty cut him off, her words sharp and final. "Not in my legacy." She didn't flinch when he blinked, taken aback. This wasn't a moment for sentimentality. Not anymore. She rose from her chair, walking slowly toward the desk where the signed documents lay neatly in a stack. The weight of those papers, of the decisions they represented, was no longer a burden. It was her freedom. She took the top sheet and slid it across the table toward him. "Here, this is the legacy I've built," she said, her voice cool. "And you don't have to agree with it, Kyle. But it's done. No more arguments, no more second-guessing." Kyle stared at the papers, his hand hovering over them. He was searching for something, anything, to make sense of what was happening, to understand why his mother had done this, why Betty had taken such drastic steps, why she had severed the ties that bound them. But she could see it in his eyes. He didn't fully understand. He never would. He slowly reached for the papers, flipping through them with hesitant fingers. As he scanned the documents, the silence between them grew heavier. It wasn't just the will, the trust, or the financial power of attorney. It was everything. It was the emotional distance that had been growing between them for years, the unspoken words that had built walls neither of them had ever bothered to knock down. He stopped when he reached the last page, the one with the clause that left Lindsay with nothing. His eyes flicked up to Betty's face, searching for some sign that she would reconsider, that this was all some mistake. But there was no room for doubt in her eyes. "This is final?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Betty nodded once, the finality of her decision settling into the air around them. "Yes, it's final. No second chances, Kyle. You had your chance to stand with me, to protect this family, but you didn't. You chose her. Now you live with the consequences." He stared at the documents for a long moment, the words sinking into him like stones in water. He opened his mouth as if to speak but closed it again, the words trapped in his throat. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, but it was a silence Betty had long grown accustomed to. She had always been the one to fill the gaps with words, with explanations, with justifications. But not anymore. Not with Kyle. Not with Lindsay. Betty crossed her arms, watching him carefully. He wasn't going to fight her. He couldn't. The truth was there, in black and white. She had taken everything from him and given it to Sadie, the only one who had ever truly understood her, the only one who had never turned her back on Betty. Kyle finally set the papers down, his eyes dropping to the floor. The fight had left him, and Betty knew that he understood. There was no more room for him in her world, not in the way he wanted to be there, not as someone who had always stood by while others made her life harder. "Say what you need to say, Kyle. I'm not going to change my mind," Betty said quietly, her voice soft but resolute. He swallowed hard, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. Betty nodded. She had given him the truth. He just wasn't ready to accept it. With one last glance at the papers in front of him, Kyle stood up. He didn't say another word, just turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy, reluctant. Betty didn't move, didn't follow him. She watched him go, the last tie to the family she had once hoped for slipping away. But in that moment, she knew that her legacy was no longer tied to him or to anyone who couldn't see her worth. It was tied to Sadie and to the future she had created, one that would never again be overshadowed by the people who had failed to protect it. As the door clicked shut behind him, Betty let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was done, and there was no going back. The late afternoon light seeped through the curtains, bathing the kitchen in a soft golden glow. Betty stood at the counter, her fingers gently stirring a pot of soup. The house felt calm now, quieter than it had in years, the remnants of chaos slowly fading into the background. Outside, the world continued its rotation, but inside, everything had changed. Wanda was in the corner of the room, reviewing the final set of legal documents with a professional air. It wasn't just a formality anymore. This was the last line of defense. Everything Betty had worked for, built with determination and silence, was about to be sealed once and for all. Betty had already taken every measure she could think of to protect her legacy, to ensure Sadie would be the one to carry it forward. But now, there was one last clause to add. One final stroke of certainty that would leave no room for doubt. No room for anyone to come back and challenge her decisions. "I've thought of one last thing," Betty said quietly, her voice steady as she set the wooden spoon down. If Lindsay contests anything, she gets nothing. Wanda didn't look up right away, but Betty could see the faintest of smiles on her face. She understood completely. "I've already prepared that clause," Wanda replied, her pen poised over the document. "If she challenges your will or any of the estate's provisions, everything goes to zero. She won't even get a token amount." Betty nodded, the weight of the decision settling in her chest. There had been years of silent manipulation, years of letting Lindsay twist her way into Betty's life and influence her decisions. But no more. She had given everything she could, and now the time had come to put an end to it. The finality of the decision wasn't as harsh as it could have been. There was no anger left in her, no bitterness, just clarity. The clarity that some people, no matter how close they once were, simply don't belong in the life you've worked so hard to build. Wanda added the final clause with a confident stroke of the pen, sealing it in black and white. Betty's legacy, her protection, was now impenetrable. No one could touch it. "I'll file it with the county tomorrow," Wanda said, her voice calm and final. "This is the last of it, Betty. There's nothing left for anyone to contest." Betty took a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders easing. It was done. There was no more to be said or done. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Sadie stepped inside, a tray of freshly baked cookies in hand. Her eyes were wide with curiosity, the same understanding that Betty had always seen in her gaze. Sadie placed the tray on the counter with a small smile, her expression a mixture of pride and tenderness. "Cookies for the final piece of the puzzle?" Sadie asked, her voice soft but knowing. Betty smiled, a quiet affection blooming in her chest as she handed Sadie a cookie. "Maybe. You've been with me through it all, Sadie. You've seen everything. And now, it's your turn to carry it." Sadie bit into the cookie, her eyes twinkling with a combination of humor and solemnity. "Some people deserve to be cut off," she said after a moment of silence, her voice carrying the weight of years of observation. Betty chuckled softly, the sound rich with the years of frustration that had finally found resolution. "No, some people cut themselves off," she replied, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength that was unmistakable. Sadie nodded, her fingers brushing the edges of the papers laid out on the counter. She didn't need an explanation. She had always known what Betty was doing, why she had made these choices, why she had fought for this future. "You've earned it, Grandma," Sadie said softly, "and I promise, I won't let it go to waste." Betty met her gaze, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. She had done what needed to be done. The legacy was secure. Wanda picked up the final stack of papers, smoothing them neatly into a folder. "I'll take care of the filing," she said, glancing over at Betty with a knowing smile. "You've done all you can, Betty. The rest is in safe hands." Betty watched her granddaughter for a moment longer, the weight of the past finally lifting. For all the years of silence, for all the years of holding back, there was a sense of peace now, a peace that could only come from having done the hard work of setting things right. Sadie turned to Betty, a small, quiet smile on her face as she reached for another cookie. "I'll take care of it," she said softly, her voice sure. Betty looked at her with a mixture of affection and determination. "I know you will. You already have." And as they stood there together in the warm, quiet kitchen, Betty knew one thing for sure. Her legacy, the home she had fought for, the family she had protected, it was safe. Sadie would carry it forward, just as Betty had always hoped. The battle was over. The legacy was secured. And Betty could finally rest, knowing that the future would be in good hands. And in that moment, she knew that some things could never be undone, no matter how hard people tried. The sun had already set when Betty made her way to her bedroom. The house was still, the last traces of the day's light filtering through the curtains. But it wasn't the stillness of peace she was after. It was the security. The certainty that no one could cross the line again. Not Lindsay. Not Kyle. She had made all the final decisions. But one last thing needed to be done. She stood in front of the door, her hand resting on the knob, staring at the lock with a quiet intensity. It had always been there, functional and unremarkable. But now it represented something far more significant than just a simple barrier between rooms. Betty had always kept the important things behind closed doors, her files, her papers, her records of everything she had fought for. Now she would make sure that no one could get to them, not without her consent. She walked to the closet and pulled out a new lock, sturdy and reinforced with metal, something she could rely on. She hadn't been in the room for hours, but it had felt like a part of her was still missing. This wasn't just about protection. It was about taking back her life, her security, and ensuring no one had the power to take it from her again. She removed the old lock, the sound of the screws unscrewing filling the room like the final pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The new lock slid into place with a satisfying click. She tightened the screws, ensuring it would hold. No more halfway measures. This would be permanent. Betty stood back and surveyed her work. She reached into her drawer, pulling out the most precious documents she had. The final versions of her will, the trust, the power of attorney, and placed them in a reinforced wooden box. She locked it away behind the now secured door. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a stronghold, something impenetrable. No one could take what was hers. As she stood there, the weight of the final decision settling over her, she heard a soft knock at the door. Sadie's gentle voice floated in from the other side. "Grandma, need help with anything?" Betty hesitated, her fingers brushing over the lock again. She had worked hard to make sure Sadie would be the one to carry the legacy forward, but there was still a part of her that wanted to protect her from the burden of it all. "Just a minute, sweetheart," Betty called out. She stepped back, taking one last look at the now secure room. It was finished. Everything was protected, everything locked away, just as it should be. Betty felt a sense of finality, but also relief. The house was now hers again. The legacy was truly hers to pass on, and no one would take it away. When Sadie entered the room, her eyes immediately went to the new lock, and then back to Betty, her curiosity piqued. Sadie had grown into someone Betty could trust, someone who could understand the weight of this moment. "Want me to help sort the files?" Sadie asked, her voice soft but steady. Betty's gaze softened, her heart swelling with pride. "Only if you promise to carry them one day," Betty replied, her voice filled with the quiet strength she had come to embody. Sadie's eyes met hers, unspoken understanding passing between them. There was no doubt in her eyes. She would carry this weight, this legacy, just as Betty had. No hesitation, no reluctance. "I promise," Sadie said, a small but resolute smile playing on her lips. Betty's hand rested on Sadie's shoulder for a moment, a silent affirmation. Sadie was ready. Ready to take what Betty had fought for. Ready to protect what mattered most. Betty knew this was the right choice. The house, the family, the future. It was all in safe hands. With a final nod, Betty turned back to the papers, giving them one last glance before the last step was taken. Wanda was already on her way over to finalize the last fire drill of all the legal steps. They had been over every detail together, ensuring that every document was filed properly, every protection in place, every loophole sealed. Wanda had been her ally through all of this, but it was time for Betty to truly take control, to lock away the past and move forward. When Wanda arrived, Betty opened the door to her. Wanda stepped inside, her gaze flicking briefly to the new lock on the bedroom door. She didn't need to say anything. Betty knew she understood. "Everything's ready?" Betty asked, her voice calm but carrying the weight of finality. Wanda nodded, pulling a folder from her bag. "All set. Everything's filed with the county, all the updates made. It's all in place, Betty. No one can undo it now." Betty exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders. The last pieces had fallen into place. She had fought for this, for the family, for herself. And now it was done. "Good," Betty said, a quiet satisfaction in her voice. "Then it's over." As Wanda left, Betty closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. She turned to see Sadie, who was still standing there, looking up at her with that same steady resolve. "Let's bake some more cookies, Grandma?" Sadie asked, her voice light, the weight of the world already lifting as she returned to something simple, something sweet. Betty smiled, a warmth flooding her chest. "Why not?" As they walked to the kitchen, Betty felt a peace settle over her. She had built her legacy. It was secure. And the future was ready for Sadie to carry forward, just as it was meant to be. No one could take that away from her now. Betty sat at her desk, the papers in front of her like an intricate puzzle she had carefully assembled over months, even years. She had pieced together her life, her legacy, with purpose and precision. Now she reviewed each binder, every page, every signature, with an intensity that matched the importance of what she had created. She read the words over and over, not because she doubted them, but because this was it. This was her life, her decisions, her legacy, her final words. She ran her fingers over the smooth, worn covers of the binders, feeling the weight of all she had done: the will, the trust, the powers of attorney, revoked, the moral guardianship clause, the future of her home, her assets, all of it locked away and sealed tight. Betty had built this, brick by brick. And now it was hers to pass on, to protect, to ensure the future would be safe. No more second chances. No more apologies. The door to the room was open, and Sadie, as always, stood just outside, waiting. Betty could hear the quiet shuffle of her granddaughter's feet as she paced, waiting for Betty's next move. Betty's gaze lifted from the papers, her mind heavy but at peace. She reached for the key to the safe, the one she had kept hidden for so long, the final touch. Her hand tightened around the cold metal, feeling its significance. She walked slowly toward the safe, opened it, and placed the binders inside, the ones that held all her final wishes. She closed the door softly with a steady hand, the weight of the metal locking into place, giving her a sense of finality, of security. Then she turned. With a final glance back at the safe, she handed the key to Sadie. Sadie took it without hesitation, her eyes meeting Betty's with that quiet understanding Betty had come to rely on. It was done. The future was in her hands now. "Take care of it, Sadie," Betty said, her voice firm but filled with a warmth only her granddaughter could receive. "I will," Sadie said softly, her hand wrapping around the key, the weight of it clear in her posture. Betty smiled, a small, contented smile before walking into the kitchen. She opened the cupboard, pulling out a plate, her fingers brushing the familiar ceramic. She set it down gently on the table and began to prepare her dinner. The world outside was still, silent, as if even nature had agreed with her decisions. Betty served herself a simple meal, nothing fancy, just a warm plate of food after a long journey of securing her future. She ate slowly, methodically, savoring every bite. The years of tension, of fear, of waiting for the right moment had melted away with the final step she had taken. She was free, and for the first time in so long, she felt a deep sense of peace. As she finished, Betty rose from the table, moving with a calmness that came from the certainty of her actions. The plate sat there, washed clean of the remnants of her meal. She rinsed it in the sink, watching the water run over it. Smooth, steady, simple. But then, as she placed it in the cabinet, carefully, with purpose, she did not let it fall into the sink as she might have once done. The plate was placed gently in the cabinet, just as everything she had worked for had been placed in her safe. Secure, final, unchangeable. Betty's hand lingered on the cabinet door for just a moment. She knew it was symbolic. A small act, but one filled with meaning. Her thoughts turned back to the moment, the one that had started it all. The moment Lindsay had dismissed her, tossed her plate in the sink with that smile of hers, as if Betty was no longer worth the effort. Betty's lips tightened, her resolve hardening like steel. My daughter-in-law tossed my plate in the sink, so I tossed her name off the will. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the space around her, bouncing off the walls of the house that had been her life's work. The decision was final. The peace she'd longed for was finally hers to hold. She turned, looking out the kitchen window as the night settled in. The world outside had not changed, but inside, everything had shifted. Betty had built her legacy. She had protected her family's future. And as she stood there, the weight of the world now finally resting gently on her shoulders, she knew that nothing would ever take this from her. And as the night pressed on, Betty Carson finally allowed herself to breathe, free from the fear that had once threatened to steal her peace. The future was in safe hands, and the legacy she had chosen would last unchallenged.